Well, Pony is back, another hiatus has come and gone, and much like the last one, it was pretty swift and painless. Either Hasbro and company have gotten much better at spacing these things out for us, or we're really due a brutal one once Season 6 ends. But that's something to worry about in the future. For now, excitement. Season 6 has resumed, and while we left off on a somewhat less than scintillating note, for the start of the second half of the season, we've been awarded with a decidedly enjoyable episode. As a mid-season premiere, the latest MLP offering, Stranger Than Fanfiction, is a real success, getting MLP Season 6 Part 2 started on just the right foot, and giving us more to get excited about than not only the mid-season finale, but the Season 6 premiere as well. It's a delightful blend of exciting adventure and silly yet smart comedy, which marks the return of one popular guest character, and the introduction of another guest character who I imagine will end up being pretty popular too. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the episode, however, is its premise. Conventions. It seems especially timely considering we've just had a few big ones in the past few weeks, notably BronyCon and San Diego Comic-Con. Now, I've never been to either of those, or any kind of PonyCon, but I have been to a few anime cons, so it's still a familiar enough thing to me. And naturally, that made it quite a lot of fun to see all the great detail put into the convention scenes. The new background pony designs, the cosplay, the merch, it's all a lot of fun. Derpy's Poor Mare's cosplay attempt especially is a delight, while I'm sure enough already has been made about the inclusion of daring do body pillows of all things. Conventions also represent rather new ground for the series, which hasn't ever really touched on the idea of organized fandom much before. I mean, there was the Rainbow Dash fan club, but that was more presented as kids just being silly. And I guess there was also that Star Swirl Con and Three's a Crowd, but really, how long did that last before we were called away for Discord shenanigans? For all the fangirling we've seen from both Rainbow Dash and Twilight in the past, the idea of adult enthusiasts actively engaging in fandom as we understand it is not something we've really ever focused on for any length. And considering the nature of the show's own fandom, its scope, and how involved it is, perhaps it's somewhat surprising we haven't had an episode all about this sort of stuff sooner. Conventions in particular have a huge place in brony culture, with the number of conventions just for this one show as compared to others being kind of absurd when you really think about it. And it's not just the showrunners, creators, and cast who have become the stars of all the conventions, but composers and, yes, the writers as well. With how very immersed the staff has allowed themselves to become in these fan activities, conventions and fandom as a whole as a subject for an episode was probably something inevitable. What perhaps I wouldn't have expected the writers to touch on, however, is fan criticism, because there is a danger in doing so, I think. Everyone's a critic, as they say, and MLP in particular has more than its fair share of overly analytical fans like myself prepared to make known exactly whatever our inane thoughts about every little thing are to everyone willing to listen. In presenting a representation of the critical fan, the show runs the risk of alienating people with the thought that it's making fun of them, or simply coming across as defensive. Case in point, let's take a look at this episode's immediate predecessor again. I said a lot about Spice Up Your Life in my review, but one thing I didn't talk about was its portrayal of criticism. This was not oversight on my part, however, but just the sense that I got from the episode. To me, it wasn't about criticism at all. Zesty Gourmand, the unpleasant food critic of the episode, may have for many invoked the similarly abrasive Anton Ego from the Pixar film Ratatouille, but it's a much harder to make connection between her and how criticism works in the real world. She may be a critic by trade, but what we get with her is knowing cartoon exaggeration. So while someone looking at the episode may have made a point of its apparent unflattering portrayal of a critic, I look past it because to me, Zesty isn't a representation of criticism, but more of a sort of systematic oppression of individual expression. To me, the episode's moral is about much more than simply sticking it to a snobby food critic. But it's interesting that on the back of that episode, wrongly taken as a dig at critics by some, we'd receive an episode that actually is about criticism, and exactly of the sort that applies to the fandom. And that it's from the same writer, Mike Vogel no less, albeit with some help from Josh Haber this time. It's also kinda interesting that this is the second episode in a row that might for some invoke Ratatouille, given that we have none other than the voice of Remy himself, Patton Oswalt, on board to fill our guest star quota for Season 6. I think Oswalt was a good grab as far as guest stars go. For me personally, he's certainly no Weird Al, my boyhood idol who I've seen no less than 6 times in concert, but unlike Lena Hall, I definitely knew who he was before the episode came around. I may not be super versed on his work, but I've liked what I've seen him in, and I do acknowledge that he has a definite place in nerd culture, which makes him feel like a natural inclusion both for this episode and the series as a whole. Moreover, his character was great, with plenty of fun lines, very aptly putting down fan frustration in an amusing way, and more generally capturing this absurd sense of determined skepticism. I would say that the show got its all out of Oswalt. I even really appreciate them allowing him to ad-lib a bit over the credits. Seems fitting for a respected comedian, and the bit was a good piece of silly fun to end the episode with. I would say that Oswalt managed to make the character pretty likable in spite of his critical tendencies. His interplay with Rainbow Dash was great too, to the point where I'm sure some people looking for a new Rainbow ship will be left intrigued. Pretty much the only thing that I'm not convinced about is the name. Quibble Pants? It's just kind of silly, even as pony names go. It also makes me wonder if he's like some kind of long-lost cousin of Fancy Pants. Hopefully we learn more about the Pants family, and why none of them actually seem to ever wear pants. But yeah, that silliness aside, back to the episode. As I said, Quibble, unlike Zesty, does actually represent criticism, and of the sort that the fandom is most familiar with. If YouTube existed in Equestria, I don't doubt he'd be doing the exact same thing I'm doing right now, each time a new Daring Do book came out. And yes, his attitude can be applied to other things. The insistent use of the phrase original trilogy and the knowledge that it's superfan Patton Oswalt supplying the voice is sure to bring Star Wars to mind for one thing, but the parallel to Pony is very easy to make if you want to, because you do see his attitude all over the place in the fandom. Oh, the series stopped being good after Lauren left. Season 1 and Season 2 are the golden era. The recent seasons suck. It's in decline, on its last legs. I even know plenty of people who engage in fan activity while being upfront with how they don't even watch the show anymore. Meanwhile, you have people like me almost perfectly mirroring Rainbow Dash's opinion when it comes to the show, honestly believing that, for the most part, it's just been getting better as it goes along. And considering how obvious the parallel to fan opinion is, there was a lot that could have gone wrong with how it was presented and ultimately resolved. It's a relief then to see how very smart the show was with it. Quibble is silly, and the extent of the stubbornness of his skepticism is astounding, but he is not simply an object of ridicule. Careful attention is brought to his discerning intellect and how it more than once is of use in the adventure. Moreover, while the events of the episode lead him to conceding a point, he is ultimately steadfast in his convictions. So easily it could have been about proving the critic wrong, diffusing their arguments, and supplanting one's own. But no, instead the ultimate message of the episode is one of accepting differences in opinion and learning to get along regardless. Which is great. It's something a lot of fans could take to heart, I think. I mean, even I often find myself falling into the trap of judging people for their opinions or trying to convince others that my opinion is better than theirs. To be able to come to terms with those you disagree with, it can be truly difficult. It's a very mature thing, and while I can see some calling it unrealistic, to me it's just the right note for this episode to end on. Well, maybe that's just because, again, I'm on Rainbow Dash's side. Realism and believability, and cohesion even, aren't as important to me as the overall feeling a work leaves me with. And this episode left me with a very positive feeling. It's inspiring to see Quibble and Rainbow sort things out and leave the episode as friends. And that, coupled with the humor, and oh yes, the adventure too, makes this episode a whole lot of fun to me. Speaking of the adventure, I feel I haven't said enough about that yet, so let me touch on it briefly before I bring this review to a close. It was great to see Daring Do again, and Caballero too. He actually provided some of the best moments in the episode, particularly for his reactions to Quibble criticizing his plan and accent. The episode is a great follow-up to Daring Don't, playing up the familiar tropes while still feeling fresh. I'm for one glad that we went a Daring Do episode without seeing Aoi Zordel for one thing, instead giving more room for Caballero to step into his own as the antagonist. It's also good to see progression on the part of Daring herself, who has clearly taken what she learned in Daring Don't to heart, showing a willingness to include Rainbow and even defer to Quibble. It's nice to see that even supporting characters can receive character development in this show that sticks. Honestly, it does such a good job as a continuation that I can see it maybe even diffusing the tension in some who were still unsure about the whole Daring Do being real thing, if not outright bringing them to reconsider entirely. So yeah, ultimately in pretty much every regard, this episode is a rousing success. It shows yet again that the MLP crew are prepared to pull out all the stops when they land a guest star. Now I wouldn't say it quite reaches the heights of the other guest star episodes, Pinkie Pride and The Main Attraction for me personally, but it was thoroughly satisfying nonetheless. A fun adventure, a thoughtful look at fan culture, and just a hilarious good time. It's a standout episode and a great way to kick off the second half of the season. This has been a RarityDash review. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.